Hello and welcome. Today I shall be talking about the early models of the T-34, fitted with the F-34 76mm gun. On paper, it looked like the early T-34 had potential. The F-34 gun was very good for the standards of the beginning of the war. It had great penetration values for that period of the war, and the armour was very thin but sloped, giving good protection. However, that's pretty much where all the good things end. The crew comfort was atrocious, the optics were horrible, the turret was crammed, no rounds were stored in the turret, only in the bottom of the hull. Despite all of this, the T-34's reputation redeemed itself, especially with the introduction of the T-34-85. The early T-34's optics were poor for everyone within the tank. The gunner's sight was slightly off with the gun, meaning your aim would be slightly off. On top of that, the commander had no cupola, only one singular optic to observe the entire battlefield with. That would be very hard. The poor radio operator or hull machine gun operator had no personal hatch. He had to use the driver's hatch. T-34s were meant to be simplified and easy to produce in the war of attrition, but this might have been a tad bit too far. The original F-34 main gun of the early T-34s performed very well compared to similar guns mounted on anti-tank platforms and other tanks. However, the problem wasn't with the gun itself, but rather the ammunition. So where was the ammunition stored within the tank? Well, it was primarily stored in the hull, with no rounds in the turret. This basically meant that the T-34 with an inexperienced crew could pump out around 2 to 3 rounds a minute, around 1 round every 30 seconds. This was an appalling figure. A German Pak-36 and other 37mm guns could not effectively penetrate the T-34's armour, however after a few shots, could maybe cause damage to something to force the T-34's crew to abandon the tank. The early T-34s were not as reliable as you think. The transmissions were horrible, so you started to see T-34s with spare transmissions literally strapped onto the back of the hull. The developed version of the Christie suspension was also a huge problem, which wasn't with the suspension itself, but more as the shortages in resources. The road wheels were meant to have rubber around them, however shortages were there, thus some factories stopped putting in rubber in their T-34 road wheels. The V2 engine had serious problems, and depending on some sources, in 1941, it could only travel an average of 100 kilometers. In 1942, this figure went down, as some T-34s could not even travel 30 to 35 kilometers. As I mentioned earlier, early T-34s with the average crew could fire around 2 to 3 times a minute, once every 30 seconds. This shouldn't take this long. Shooting at a target isn't all about firing then reloading repeatedly. It is about finding the target, then telling your gunner where it is, then to see what range and if the vehicle is moving, to see what lead it has, then lining up the gun and firing the shot. All of this had to be accomplished. However, when you have no proper optics, improper coordination due to the lack of radio, and the commander doubling as a loader, this meant that the commander was at the bottom of the hull opening ammunition boxes to get a new round, and then to get back in the turret, which by the way didn't have a basket, and then to load the gun, and then look for another target. All of that just for one target. That's why a 3-man turret on the -85 was so much better than the crammed 2-man turret of the early T-34s. For example, there was a T-34. It took something like 23 rounds to be taken out. The Germans, armed with the 37mm guns, couldn't penetrate the majority of the T-34's armour. Finally, with a lucky shot, managed to jam the turret ring of the T-34. However, why did a T-34 let 23 rounds get shot at him? Well, the commander was probably extremely overloaded, and the optics were almost useless. Operation Barbarossa had meant that the full might of the Soviet army was thrust straight into a war. Crew training was limited, and time on the tank was extremely limited. Crews who weren't trained to the full extent of proper training would be put in an extreme disadvantage compared to the tank crews of the Germans, who had more experience from invading Poland and the Low Countries before going for Russia. The use of sloped armour to enhance the effective thickness of the armour on a tank was not a new concept. Many tanks before the T-34 had this. However, the T-34 was one of the first to manufacture tanks with sloped armour on this scale before. Sloping armour on a tank would mean that the crew space would have to suffer. In the T-34 this is shown quite clearly. The lack of turret space within the turret is quite clear, as well as the front and sides. The turret ring is quite small, however was widened in the T-34-85. Thank you very much for watching and staying to the end of this video. I hope you have enjoyed. I missed a few things, just trying to make this video a little bit shorter. That's it from me today. I hope you have a good day and stay safe in these difficult times.